So I'm going to explain a bit more about intake margin right now because that's really where the money is, that's where our profit is, and so that's where we start to get really technical with our discussions, and that's where a lot of our discussions are focused around with our pricing. So as I've mentioned, cost price and your selling price determine your intake margin. And the higher your intake margin, the more your profit is. So obviously you want your intake margin to be as high as it possibly can, really. And so the way you would achieve that ideally is through a lower cost price and a higher selling price. So you want to be selling something for as much as you possibly can. And where we start to play around with things and where we start to really discuss things is we would take cost prices by our quoted by our suppliers, and we would see, okay, how much does it cost to remove, an extra button, an extra zip that we've got on this design. If we were to not have that opening, if we were to not have that extra frill, or if we were to not colour it like the colour that we've decided. So that's how we start to manoeuvre this cost price and get it as low as we possibly can and reprice structure ourselves and get a higher intake margin. And so in the instance of this pink top, we've got ourselves a 75% margin on that, and anything in this region I would say is quite a comfortable margin. For your typical high street retailers, a early 70% upwards is a comfortable margin. That's what you would be aiming to be around. And then any margin below 70%, so your 60s or 50s, anything lower than that is quite a tight margin, and you don't particularly want to be buying something at that intake margin because that's quite tight. We also consider things that we're going to do in the future, because now when you take something in as an intake margin that's already quite low, there is going to be promotions, there is going to be sale, there is going to be damage and loss. And so you're not going to make profit of it at that initial 75%. Like this 75% is the best it's ever going to be. For example, if we were to lower this cost price a little bit from £5, let's say we've gone back to the supplier and we've said, we want to take that extra frill that's on the center of the top, we're going to reduce that frill, so how much to make it a little cheaper? And they come back and say, oh, well then that will only be £4 then, and then we put that in. That makes our intake margin go up from 75% to 80%, and that's how we start to really play around with things. That's how we can maneuver that cost. Or even we can go and do another round of comp shopping and we can decide that, we can actually sell it at £25. We don't have to sell it at 20. We could say other shops are doing a top like this at 25 or even 30, but let's sit in the safe point and do 25. And if I was to put that in there, that makes our margin go up to 84%. And so you can see how that formula really starts to work for us. And those are discussions that we have in our sign-off meeting because we really want to decide that. So I'll just put these prices back. Right. And then, so another way that we play around with our intake margin is through our units. So I'll highlight that column here, and our units for all of these will sit there, and that determines how many units of each style we've decided we want to buy. And the reason that we consider our margin when deciding our units is because if you have something at a really high intake margin, you want to buy more units in it. But if you have something that's quite a tight margin, I'll use the example of this one, the blue top on the second row, which we can see is being bought at a 67% margin, and that's quite tight. So what we've done here is we've only bought 550 units in comparison to the 1,000 units of the pink top, because the pink top is at a 75% intake margin, so we've gone and bought 1,000 of it. But for the blue top, we're only going to buy 500 because the intake margin is tight. And so Another thing I'll talk about with intake margin is that just because a particular style has a tight or low intake margin, it doesn't mean we're going to run away from it and not buy it. It's still going to make us money, and we are still going to put it in the range, but we're just going to reduce the amount of units we buy behind it. And that's how we really start to play around and maximize on our profit. Because we have two types of margins. We have the intake margin, and then what I'm going to go over and explain is our gross margin. So your gross margin, I'll go over here, is highlighted over in yellow, is over here. And our gross margin takes into consideration the amount of units we've bought behind something, and it does calculations for us, and it tells us the margin of the cost price and selling price in consideration of the amount of units, and it's told us what percentage the gross margin is. And when you are smart with your units, you can lift your intake margin over into your gross margin. So our total intake margin here is 72%, but our total gross margin has lifted to 73%. And the way that we've managed to achieve a higher gross margin is through being smart with the units. We've gone smart with the tight intake margins, only bought a little, and then maximized our buy on our better intake margins to manage to make our gross margin even higher. Because your gross margin is more of an indication of your profit. And what I will discuss another time is your different kinds of margins, because there's intake margin, there's gross margin, but there's also profits, there's gross profit and net profit. And so your gross profit really is your overall profit. You've not considered how much it's going to cost to package things, pay people, all of those little things that come into play. But on a range plan, all we are considered to do as the buying and merchandising team is look at your gross margin. Other parts of the company will look at, how much that goes into our overall profit, but we're just looking at the gross, so how much is overall coming in. That's the way we look at that. So another thing we look at is our total cost value. So in this section here, this is kind of like the summary of our range plan, because it's got your gross margin, which is basically your total margin considered with your units. And then we've got our total cost value. And down here we can see that that's 40,000, so we'll say 40k. And that would be in retrospect to our budget. So we will know how much of our budget we've been given at the beginning of a season, and we need to spend somewhere close to that. In our initial range building, we don't want to spend our whole budget on the beginning of the range. We want to leave some open to buy. And I'll explain open to buy in a separate video, but what that basically is us leaving money aside to be able to buy stuff closer to the season, when we've seen some activity going on. When you're in the season and things are trading really, really well, we want to go back to the factory and top it up really quickly. We would be using open to buy money. So if our total cost value here is coming up to 40,000, but our overall budget that we've been given for the season is 50,000, that's leaving quite a small open to buy. You want to leave a little bit more than that. So we would be looking at that and thinking, okay, we need to get some cost prices down then if our total cost value is looking quite high. And then another thing we look at is our selling value. So your total selling value is how much you would be expecting to take in from this season. It's basically all of the selling prices added together times by the amount of units you're buying, and that's how much your selling value is. So we know that we are going to expect to take 150,000 out of all of those styles. because we've looked at the units, we've looked at the pricing, and that's how much we should take. And so all this information here can be summarized into these 3 columns highlighted here, because this is where our total information is. It's our total costing, it's our total selling value, and it's our gross margin, our overall profit that we're going to make from this range. And so all of this information would lead on to what we would call a line sheet or a sales sheet. And I'll explain that in my next video, where we lay out all of our styles to show how much each style is selling, at what intake margin, and all of the profits that we're making on each of the styles. And I'll do the same thing. I'll show you up a nice line sheet, and I'll really take you through how we go from range building over to reading sales. And just as a general picture, this range plan is, how we would build a range in buying and merchandising. So I hope this video has been somewhat helpful. Like, comment, subscribe, and let me know what else you'd like me to share or teach, or any information you want.